In a world blanketed by ice and quiet skies, early humans learned to survive through unity, patience, and the steady rhythm of the seasons. Their days were simple but purposeful, gathering, learning, and growing together beneath ancient stars. Here begins their story. The world was quieter then, vast, white, and endless. Great mountains of ice stretched across the horizon, sparkling beneath a pale winter sun. In this frozen landscape, a small group of humans journeyed slowly across the tundra, wrapped in furs, their footprints trailing behind like a thin thread, connecting them to the distant past. They were hunter-gatherers, moving with the rhythms of the land, guided by the seasons and the migrations of the animals they depended upon. Life was harsh, yet simple. Every breath was a reminder of their resilience, every step a testament to their determination to endure in a world few today could imagine. Tonight they would reach a familiar shelter, a low cliff face where the wind was kinder and the fire could dance freely. There, their story would continue, written not in ink, but in survival. The night settled slowly across the tundra, dimming the sky into a deep indigo. The family, 2 elders, a young pair, and several children, reached the rocky overhang they had visited many times before. It stood like a patient guardian, weathered by centuries of cold winds, its stone surface marked with the faint traces of earlier fires and ancient memories. Here they unpacked their burdens. The elders moved first, experienced hands knowing exactly where the fire should be built. Dry moss and small sticks were carefully arranged, and sparks were coaxed from flint with practiced ease. Soon a small flame flickered to life, its warm glow pushing back the grip of winter. The fire crackled softly, a comforting and familiar song, a promise that the night would not swallow their warmth or hope. The children sat close, rubbing their numb fingers together, their cheeks flushed from the frozen wind. Their world was smaller than that of their ancestors, and smaller than anything we know today, defined not by borders or maps, but by the movement of herds, the patterns of weather, and the instinctive knowledge passed down from generation to generation. The adults unwrapped their packs made from tanned hides and sinew. Inside were precious supplies, dried berries gathered months ago, strips of smoked meat, tiny carved tools of bone and stone. Each item had a purpose. Nothing was wasted. In the Ice Age, survival came not from abundance, but from the deep wisdom of how to use every resource with care. The younger hunter of the group, a man not yet hardened by many winters, removed from his belt a spearhead of flint. Its edges were sharp, chipped with hours of careful work. As he examined it in the firelight, the elder beside him nodded in approval and spoke quietly, soft words meant to teach, to guide, to pass down knowledge like a family heirloom. The boy listened eagerly, absorbing skills he would one day teach his own children. Outside, the wind sang through the frozen branches of ancient pines, but here beneath the rock shelter, the world felt calm. The fire's glow reflected in the children's eyes as stories began to unfold. Stories of great mammoths thundering across the valleys, of hunts won and lost, of times when the ice was harsher, and times when it thawed enough to let the earth show green again. As the flames danced, the family felt something we might recognize even now, the comfort of being together, sheltered from the cold, sharing food, warmth, stories, and the gentle rhythm of a night that would carry them safely until dawn. Their world may have been cold and unforgiving, but around the fire they were warm, connected, and deeply alive in the heart of the Ice Age.
Morning arrived gradually, with a faint glow stretching across the sky.
There was no sunrise in the dramatic, colorful sense we know today, just a pale light that slowly strengthened, revealing the world in muted whites and grays. The Ice Age was quiet at dawn, as if the land took a long breath before waking. Inside the shelter, the fire had sunk into a bed of glowing coals, still warm beneath a layer of ash. The adults stirred first. In this world, waking early was not a matter of discipline, it was necessity. Their lives were measured in daylight hours, each one needed for gathering, repairing tools, and scouting for food. The elder woman, her hair silver and braided with strips of animal sinew, moved to the edge of the fire and prepared the morning meal. A small pot, shaped of hardened clay and carried with care through their travels, was filled with a broth made the night before. Into it she added dried roots and shavings of cured meat. The smell was modest, but comforting, a promise of strength for the long day ahead. Outside the shelter, the young hunter stepped into the brittle morning air. Frost clung to his lashes, and the cold bit into any skin not wrapped in fur. He knelt in the snow and inspected the tracks that had been left in the night. Small animals had passed by, hare perhaps, and the delicate hoofprints of reindeer further in the distance. He ran his gloved fingers along the impressions, reading the land as one might read a book. The tracks were not just signs of animals, they were hints, clues, messages written by nature herself. He returned to the shelter and reported quietly to the elder. The next migration of reindeer would pass through within a few days. If the group could make their way to a nearby valley before then, they would have a chance to replenish their meat supplies for weeks, maybe months. It was good news. As they finished their meal, the family prepared for the tasks of the day. Some would gather firewood, low pine branches and fallen limbs barely visible beneath the snow. Others would search for edible roots, nuts stored by animals, or thin berries that still clung stubbornly to winter branches. Even in the harshest seasons, the land offered something to those who knew where to look. The children were given lessons while the day's chores took shape. They were taught how to twist fibers into cordage using dried sinew and plant material. Their small hands fumbled at first, but gradually found rhythm. Twist, pull, smooth. It was a humble but vital skill. Cordage held together shelters, tools, weapons, and clothing. It was the backbone of survival. Later, the men worked together near the shelter, sitting on smooth stones warmed slightly by the fire. Using antler and stone tools, they knapped flint into fresh blades. Each strike was deliberate, a practiced motion learned over countless winters. Chips of stone fell at their feet like sparks of frozen lightning. The young hunter shaped a new spearhead, checking every angle, sharpening every edge. These were tools that life depended on. Though the Ice Age world was demanding, there was a kind of peace in the rhythm of survival. The tasks were challenging, but clear. Every member had purpose. Every day had meaning, whether through work, learning, or the quiet moments gathered around the fire. As the sun climbed, a gentle wind swept over the tundra, carrying with it the faint sound of distant herds moving across the ice. The family listened, their hearts stirred by the instinctive call of the hunt. There would be a journey ahead, a migration of their own, but for today, they worked slowly and steadily, preparing for a future written in snow, stone, and memory. The Ice Age was vast and unforgiving, yet in the quiet companionship of their simple tasks, the people found warmth, a life lived not in struggle alone, but in purpose, knowledge, and an enduring connection to the land they called home.
The afternoon slowly unfolded, stretching across the frozen plains like a long exhale. Though the sun never rose high during this age, its presence softened the cold just enough to allow movement, gathering, and travel. The group emerged from their shelter with quiet purpose, each knowing their role without need for spoken instruction. This was a way of life where survival relied as much on routine as on instinct. The elder man, wrapped in layered hides and carrying a carved staff, led two of the older children toward a stand of hardy pines. Their mission was simple but vital: collect enough wood to keep the shelter warm through the coming night. Fire was everything in this age. It cooked their food, hardened their tools, provided light in the darkness, and most importantly, shielded them from the killing cold. Without it, the night could easily claim a life. The snow crunched beneath their fur-wrapped feet as they walked. The children scanned the ground for the fallen branches they knew to search for, thick enough to burn long, dry enough to catch easily, not so large that they couldn't carry back. The elder showed them how to test each piece of wood with a quick knock against a stone or tree trunk. A hollow sound meant it would burn well. A dull sound meant moisture, rot, or dead weight. Nearby, the remaining adults focused on the hunt to come. They knelt in the snow, drawing a rough map of the local terrain with a sharp stick. They marked the nearby river, now mostly frozen over, and the sloping valley beyond, where animals frequently passed during migrations. They considered the wind direction, the safest approach routes, and places where the hunters could lay in wait without being seen or scented. These people planned their hunts not only with skill, but with remarkable understanding of the land, an intelligence honed through generations of observation. Meanwhile, one of the women began preparing travel gear. She inspected fur boots with sharp eyes, tightening seams and checking for cracks in the leather. Then she melted a small amount of animal fat in a stone bowl and rubbed it into the hide, softening and waterproofing it for the miles ahead. On the Ice Age tundra, one broken shoe could mean frostbite, or far worse. Back at the shelter, the children returned with the elder, their small arms piled with dry branches and fallen pine. They placed the wood near the fire pit and proudly showed what they had collected. Praise was quiet but genuine, a warm nod, a gentle hand on the shoulder. Here, survival was shared, and every contribution mattered. Later, the group gathered for another task, mending their ropes and cords. Thin fibers of dried sinew, softened by water, were stretched and twisted together. The younger girl, no more than 7, practiced knotting the newly formed cords with her small, determined fingers. She made mistakes, fumbled, and tried again, while her mother guided her patiently. Learning was not rushed in this world. It flowed naturally, like the seasons, and children grew into survival not through lectures, but through doing. As the afternoon deepened, the sky turned a muted blue-gray, hinting at a change in wind. The elder man stepped outside and sniffed the air thoughtfully. Snow was coming. Perhaps not a storm, but enough to make tracks harder to read. They would need to move soon before the weather changed further. Time meant everything during migrations. Miss the herds, and food could become dangerously scarce. Before nightfall, they prepared their evening meal early. A few strips of dried meat were heated over the fire until tender, and roots softened in a clay pot. No feast by modern standards, yet here it tasted rich, comforting, and full of life. They ate slowly, sharing stories of hunts past, of winters harsher than this one, of animals powerful enough to be both revered and feared. The conversation was calm, almost meditative. Life in the Ice Age demanded resilience, but it also encouraged a deep appreciation of simple moments, warmth, safety, togetherness. Around the fire, they were not merely surviving, they were living, learning, bonding, passing on traditions older than memory. Outside, the sun dipped again toward the horizon, though it had never climbed far. The land grew still, waiting for the night and the next chapter of their journey. And within the shelter, surrounded by stone and flickering firelight, the family rested with quiet certainty. Tomorrow, they would follow the herds. Tomorrow, the world would test them again. But tonight, they were safe, strong, and exactly where they needed to be. Night descended once more, wrapping the tundra in a deep, silver stillness. The fire at the heart of the shelter burned low, its embers pulsing like slow, sleeping stars. The people settled around it, wrapped in layered furs, warming their hands and faces as the last tasks of the day gave way to quiet reflection. This was the time for stories, one of the most important traditions in their world. Before language was ever written, before symbols were carved into bone or clay, stories were how knowledge traveled through generations. They taught survival, courage, respect, and the understanding that humans were only one thread woven into the great fabric of the natural world. The elder man settled himself near the fire, the light dancing in the deep lines etched across his face. He began to speak in a calm, rhythmic voice that seemed to blend with the crackling fire. The children leaned forward, eyes wide and eager. Even the adults listened with reverence, for a good story in the Ice Age was more than entertainment. It was guidance, reassurance, and a link to ancestors long gone. He told of a time when their people followed a herd of mammoths across a vast plain, traveling for many days without shelter. Food was scarce, and the cold was biting enough to challenge even the strongest among them. But just when hope began to wane, they encountered a hidden valley, untouched by harsh winds. There, beneath tall cliffs, grew hardy grass and shrubs, and the herd rested. The people were able to hunt just enough to survive, and when they offered thanks to the spirits of the land, the mammoths moved on, having sustained them for another season. In the elders' telling, mammoths were not merely animals, they were sacred beings, ancient companions in the struggle for survival. They were to be respected, never taken without gratitude. The children listened solemnly, absorbing the lesson. Survival was not won through strength alone, but through humility, balance, and honor. When the story ended, another began, this time from the younger hunter. He spoke of a boy from another clan who had once become lost in the snows. Guided only by the stars and the distant song of migrating birds, he found his way back after many days. His family welcomed him with joy, yet his story served as a reminder to all. Learn the land, learn the sky, learn every sound, every scent, every sign, because out here, knowledge was life.
A calm and steady voice returned, like early sunlight melting frost. Dawn arrived with a soft, pale glow, the kind that gently nudged the world awake rather than commanding it. Inside the shelter, the embers still pulsed faintly beneath their ash covering, proof that the fire had survived the night, and the day could begin without the fear of bitter cold sinking in too deeply. The first to rise was the elder woman. She moved quietly, careful not to disturb the children still curled beneath their blankets. With practiced motions, she crouched near the fire pit and added twigs, bark, and slivers of fat-soaked moss. Soon a small flame awakened, stretching upward like a waking creature, and light began to flicker against the stone walls of the shelter. One by one, the others stirred. Sleep in this age was never long or indulgent. The body rested just enough to recover from the previous day. The moment consciousness returned, the world demanded attention. Food needed gathering, tools needed fixing, animals needed tracking, and the cold never gave respite for long. Outside, the sky was a mix of faded blue and hazy gray. A thin sheet of new snow lay across the ground, just enough to soften the existing tracks and make reading the world more challenging. The young hunter stepped out first, pulling his hood tighter around his face. He scanned the horizon slowly, eyes adjusting to the long distances of the tundra. The wind was light today, but carried the suggestion of coming change. Today would be the beginning of movement. The reindeer migration, predicted by their reading of tracks and seasons, would soon pass through the nearby valley. If the group wanted fresh meat, not just for the day, but to dry and store for the coming weeks, they would need to leave their temporary shelter and meet the herd before the snow deepened further. Inside, the group ate a modest breakfast, warmed broth and a small share of preserved meat. Nobody spoke much, not because of fear or worry, simply because they knew the ritual of preparation. When great tasks lay ahead, silence helped sharpen the senses. Soon, the work began. Furs were tied securely around shoulders and legs. Hunting spears were checked, blades tested against bone and wood. Stone knives were sharpened, their edges catching the firelight like tiny shards of moon. Bone needles stitched small tears in clothing, ensuring not even a thread of cold could slip through. They prepared travel packs, light but essential. Dried food, small flint cores for tool repair, sinew cord, tiny bone fishhooks, firestones wrapped in fur, and a single clay pot padded with grass to protect it from cracking in the cold. The children, though too young to join the hunt, would not be idle. They would travel with the group. This was a world where families moved as one, learning the land as soon as they could walk. Two of the children carried bundles of gathered wood across their backs. Their proud expressions said everything. They were contributing. They were useful. They were growing. Before leaving, the group paused outside the shelter. The elder man touched the stone wall gently, marking a small symbol with charcoal, just as others had done before him. It was not a map or a message for the world. It was a simple sign, something that told future travelers, or themselves if they returned, that they had once found refuge here. Then they walked. Their breath rose in pale clouds, snow crunched rhythmically beneath their boots. The land spread wide and quiet before them, endless tundra, dotted with pine and glacial stone, and beyond that the great unknown that every Ice Age traveler accepted with steady heart. As they traveled, the landscape revealed subtle signs. Upright tufts of grass pressed down by animals recently passing, scrapes in the frozen soil where hooves had dug for hidden plants, a faint smell in the air, musky, wild, unmistakable. Reindeer were near. The group paused at a ridge overlooking the valley. The elder man crouched and scanned the terrain, eyes narrowing with concentration. Below, faint shapes moved, distant, quiet, steady. A small scouting band of reindeer grazed among snow-covered shrubs. They were early. The herd had finished traveling through the night. The hunters exchanged looks, not fear but calculation. Movement now would need caution. A single misstep could send the entire herd running for miles, wasting precious days and energy. They began to plan the approach in hushed voices. There was no rush. In the Ice Age, hurried decisions cost lives. They studied the slopes, the wind direction, the paths the animals might take. The young hunter listened intently, absorbing every suggestion and strategy the elder provided. In this world, mentorship was quiet, constant, woven into daily living. Behind them, the youngest child tugged gently on her mother's fur sleeve and pointed upward. The pale disk of the sun was barely visible through thin clouds, so faint it almost looked ghostly. Yet to the people of this age, that sun was everything. Heat, direction, season, rhythm. The mother smiled softly and lifted the child into her arms. Even here, in the frozen vastness, moments of tenderness could bloom like rare winter flowers. Soon the hunt would begin, but not yet. First, they would observe, think, and read the land with patience older than civilization itself. For in the Ice Age, survival belonged not to the strongest, but to those who listened, to nature, to the elders, to silence. And as the wind settled and the reindeer grazed below, the family prepared to write the next chapter of their ancient journey across snow and time.
The group waited at the ridge, silent and still, as the reindeer grazed below. In the Ice Age, a hunt was not something rushed. It was a conversation with the land, with the wind, with the prey itself. The hunters had learned over generations that to succeed, they must move in harmony with everything around them. The elder man crouched in the snow, one hand resting on the ground. He could feel the faint tremor of small hooves moving in the valley, barely perceptible, yet unmistakable to someone who had spent a lifetime reading the earth. The young hunter watched him carefully, noting how the old man's eyes tracked not just the animals, but every contour of the terrain. The dip in the land that could hide an approach, the shadowed shelf of rock that could provide shelter from a shifting wind. Below, the scouting group of reindeer looked peaceful, unaware. But they were only the first. The main herd would come soon, perhaps by evening. That was the time to strike, when the majority were still, when the hunters could take only what was needed. For now they returned to camp, not the stone shelter they had left behind, but a temporary outpost nearby, hidden among low shrubs and rocky outcrops. Here they would prepare weapons, watch the animals, and rest before the evening's efforts. As they walked down the slope, the older woman gathered children around her for another lesson. She pointed out tracks in the snow, some deep, some shallow, some fresh, others softened around the edges by time and melting frost. With each, she explained what made them different. Fresh droppings meant the herd had passed recently and was feeding nearby. Crisp hoof prints with sharp outlines meant movement in the last hour. Tracks partially filled with snow showed where the herd had been before dawn. To modernize, these prints might seem indistinguishable, but to Ice Age families, reading the land was as essential as reading a book would be thousands of years later. Every sign was a message: food, danger, opportunity, or warning. The young children listened seriously, their small faces intent. They were learning not through formal instruction, but through immersion, absorbing the world directly through their senses, gathering wisdom with every footstep. Back at the temporary site, the adults set to work. The hunters pulled out wrapped bundles of spare spear points, made from carefully knapped flint. Some were wide-bladed for piercing the thick hides of larger animals. Others were narrow, designed to slip between ribs with ease. Each point represented hours of labor, shaping, sharpening, testing. The young hunter sat beside the elder and watched as he chipped a new blade from a flint core. The elder's hands moved slowly, patiently. He rotated the stone, examined it, struck gently with a piece of antler, never too hard. Too much force and the stone would split the wrong way. Too little and the edge would crumble. "You must listen to the stone," the elder murmured. "It tells you how it wishes to break." The young man nodded, replaying the movement in his mind. This was more than tool-making. It was craftsmanship as sacred as any ritual. Nearby, the eldest woman inspected the hunter's clothing. She ran her fingers along seams, checking for weak stitches. A gap in a seam meant cold creeping in, a slow enemy as lethal as any predator. When she found a flaw, she threaded a bone needle with sinew and strengthened the stitch, her motions as sure and practiced as the elder knapping stone. While the adults worked, the children helped melt snow in carved wooden bowls, creating water to drink. They fed the fire with small sticks and broken pine cones, tasks small enough for their hands, but vital to the group's well-being. Food was shared at midday. Dried meat softened in warm broth. Thin slices passed to each member of the group. No one took more than their share. The Ice Age taught fairness by necessity, not philosophical belief, but survival logic. A group stayed strong only when all were fed. After eating, they rested, not a deep sleep, but a watchful stillness. Hunters needed sharp senses and steady breath. Too much excitement or tension could shake the hands, weaken the spear throw. When the sun slipped lower, the wind shifted. A faint sound drifted across the snow, the distant thundering of many hooves. The main herd was approaching, moving toward the valley as expected. The elder stood slowly, listening. Then, with a nod, he quietly motioned the hunters forward. The women and children would remain behind at the observation point. They were safe here and could watch from a distance, learning as generations had always done. The hunters moved silently across the snow, footsteps light, bodies low. They kept downwind, following the curvature of the land, using dips and ridges to conceal themselves. Spears were held loosely, not clutched in nervous fists, but carried with readiness and confidence. Their faces were calm, even serene. They were not predators driven by desperation. They were part of the cycle of life here, taking only what they needed, knowing that in the balance of nature, their own lives depended on respect as much as skill. As they neared the valley, the young hunter looked ahead and saw the massive shapes of the reindeer. There were many, dozens, perhaps more. Strong, powerful animals with antlers like branching trees and coats thick enough to withstand the cruelest cold. It was a magnificent sight, one that stirred both hunger and awe. The hunt was not yet begun. First, they would choose the right animal, the safest approach, the most natural point of separation. A mistake could scatter the herd or wound an animal they could not finish, a tragedy in a world where nothing could be wasted. The elder placed a hand on the young hunter's shoulder, steady and reassuring. The young hunter met his gaze, and no words were needed. The Ice Age demanded courage, discipline, and patience. And now, as the sun dipped low and the frozen land held its breath, the hunters prepared to step into the ancient dance of survival, a dance their ancestors had performed for thousands of years, and one their descendants would someday continue, long after their footsteps faded from the snow.
The herd moved slowly across the valley, a living tide of fur and muscle flowing over the white earth. Their breath steamed in the frigid air, forming pale halos around their muzzles. Some dug through the snow with their hooves, uncovering patches of frozen moss or winter grasses. Others stood alert, ears twitching, listening for the faintest sign of danger. Up on the slope, hidden behind a low ridge, the hunters observed in silence. This moment, before the hunt, was one of the most critical. To modernize, our herd of animals might seem unpredictable, chaotic. But to Ice Age hunters, the reindeer had rhythms, patterns, predictable behaviors. The hunters learned to read them the way we read maps. The largest males stood on the outer edges or on higher ground, acting as guardians. Mothers and calves gathered toward the center, where snow was churned softest and danger was lowest. Nervous animals flicked their ears and shifted their weight, showing the first signs of sensing something amiss. The elder hunter pointed silently with 2 fingers toward a section of the valley where the snow was shallower and the reindeer clustered more tightly. If the hunters could approach from below, using a rock outcropping as cover, they might separate a young bull, a good balance of meat and safety. The young hunter nodded. His pulse quickened, but his face remained composed. Fear had no place here. Hesitation could spook the herd. Anxiety could lead to mistakes. And in this world, Mistakes could cost the group dearly. They began their approach. The snow muffled most sounds, but even so, the hunters stepped slowly and deliberately, placing their feet on firmer patches where the crust wouldn't crack loudly. They kept low, using shrubs and uneven terrain as natural shields. Their breath came in controlled exhales, small puffs that disappeared quickly into the frigid air. As they moved, each hunter carried a spear tipped with razor-sharp flint. The shafts were polished bone and wood, reinforced with sinew bindings. Hunting with spears in the Ice Age required more than physical skill. It required calm nerves, an understanding of animal behavior, and the ability to strike at precisely the right moment. The young hunter's mind replayed memories of past lessons. Never run directly at the herd. Never throw unless sure of the strike. Always choose the target before lifting the arm. Chaos meant lost opportunities, or worse. Back at the observation site, the women and children watched from a distance. They stood on a slope that provided a clear vantage over the valley, but kept them far from danger. Even the children understood the gravity of the moment. Their chatter quieted, replaced with wide eyes and bated breath as they watched the hunters become small moving shapes against the snow. The elder woman rested a hand on the youngest child's shoulder. She didn't speak. Words would only heighten the tension, but her presence was reassurance enough. This was a familiar scene, repeated countless times through generations. Down below, the elder hunter signaled, just a small tilt of the hand. They had reached the position. The herd continued grazing, unaware. The young hunter crawled forward on his belly until he reached the last bit of cover, a boulder half buried in the snow. He peered out carefully. The chosen animal, a sturdy young bull with promising size, stood slightly apart from the rest, its head lowered as it scraped the snow for food. It was close, close enough that a well-thrown spear could reach it. But still, they did not rush. The elder counted the wind direction, still in their favor. He listened for the sound of hooves, steady, unalarmed. And then he glanced at the sky, reading the shifting light. Experience had taught him that if he waited too long, the bull might rejoin the core of the herd, making the strike difficult without alarming the whole group. Finally, he gave the signal. The young hunter rose into a crouch, spear held high. He took a single step forward, anchoring his foot in a firm patch of snow, muscles bracing. His heart pounded, but his mind was calm. He exhaled slowly. Then he threw. The spear flew through the frigid air, its flint point glinting with a sliver of sunlight. It struck true, just behind the front shoulder, where the ribs parted enough for a clean kill. The young bull staggered, letting out a sharp, pained snort. The herd reacted instantly, animals bounding away in a roar of hooves and snow, but the hunters were already moving. They rushed forward, spears ready, aiming to finish the animal quickly and humanely. The bull collapsed after a brief struggle. The elder placed a steadying hand on its side as its breathing slowed. The hunters remained silent. This was not a moment for cheering or celebration, but for respect. They had taken the life, so their own could continue. When the bull fell still, the elder knelt and murmured a few quiet words, not a prayer in any formal sense, but a gesture of gratitude that had existed since immemorial, thanking the animal, thanking the land, acknowledging the balance that allowed them to survive. Only then did the hunters begin their work. They moved with swift, practiced efficiency.
The hide was cut, peeled, and laid aside for tanning. The best cuts of meat were separated immediately to be carried back. Tendons were removed to dry into strong cord. Even the bones would be used later for tools and weapons. Nothing could be wasted here, not in the Ice Age, where every part of the animal was precious. Up on the hill, the children watched the distant figures bend over at the sight, busy with purposeful movements. The youngest girl tugged at her mother's sleeve and whispered, "Did they do it?" The woman smiled softly and nodded. "Yes," she answered, voice warm but quiet. "Tonight we eat well." And as the hunters finished preparing their load, the sky began to darken with early winter dusk. They strapped bundles of meat and hide to their shoulders, ready for the journey back. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of snow and the promise of a cold night ahead. But the family would face that night with strength, with warmth, and with gratitude, for the hunt had succeeded, and the ancient rhythm of survival continued just as it had for countless generations before them.
The herd moved slowly across the valley, a living tide of fur and muscle flowing over the white earth. Their breath steamed in the frigid air, forming pale halos around their muzzles. Some dug through the snow with their hooves, uncovering patches of frozen moss or winter grasses. Others stood alert, ears twitching, listening for the faintest sign of danger. Up on the slope, hidden behind a low ridge, the hunters observed in silence. This moment, before the hunt, was one of the most critical. To modernize, our herd of animals might seem unpredictable, chaotic. But to Ice Age hunters, the reindeer had rhythms, patterns, predictable behaviors. The hunters learned to read them the way we read maps. The largest males stood on the outer edges or on higher ground, acting as guardians. Mothers and calves gathered toward the center, where snow was churned softest and danger was lowest. Nervous animals flicked their ears and shifted their weight, showing the first signs of sensing something amiss. The elder hunter pointed silently with 2 fingers toward a section of the valley where the snow was shallower and the reindeer clustered more tightly. If the hunters could approach from below, using a rock outcropping as cover, they might separate a young bull, a good balance of meat and safety. The young hunter nodded. His pulse quickened, but his face remained composed. Fear had no place here. Hesitation could spook the herd. Anxiety could lead to mistakes. And in this world, mistakes could cost the group dearly. They began their approach. The snow muffled most sounds, but even so, the hunters stepped slowly and deliberately, placing their feet on firmer patches where the crust wouldn't crack loudly. They kept low, using shrubs and uneven terrain as natural shields. Their breath came in controlled exhales, small puffs that disappeared quickly into the frigid air. As they moved, each hunter carried a spear tipped with razor-sharp flint. The shafts were polished bone and wood, reinforced with sinew bindings. Hunting with spears in the Ice Age required more than physical skill. It required calm nerves, an understanding of animal behavior, and the ability to strike at precisely the right moment. The young hunter's mind replayed memories of past lessons. Never run directly at the herd. Never throw unless sure of the strike. Always choose the target before lifting the arm. Chaos meant lost opportunities, or worse. Back at the observation site, the women and children watched from a distance.
They stood on a slope that provided a clear vantage over the valley, but kept them far from danger. Even the children understood the gravity of the moment. Their chatter quieted, replaced with wide eyes and bated breath as they watched the hunters become small, moving shapes against the snow. The elder woman rested a hand on the youngest child's shoulder. She didn't speak. Words would only heighten the tension, but her presence was reassurance enough. This was a familiar scene, repeated countless times through generations. Down below, the elder hunter signaled, just a small tilt of the hand. They had reached the position. The herd continued grazing, unaware. The young hunter crawled forward on his belly until he reached the last bit of cover, a boulder half buried in the snow. He peered out carefully. The chosen animal, a sturdy young bull with promising size, stood slightly apart from the rest, its head lowered as it scraped the snow for food. It was close enough that a well-thrown spear could reach it. But still, they did not rush. The elder counted the wind direction, still in their favor. He listened for the sound of hooves, steady, unalarmed. And then he glanced at the sky, reading the shifting light. Experience had taught him that if he waited too long, the bull might rejoin the core of the herd, making the strike difficult without alarming the whole group. Finally, he gave the signal. The young hunter rose into a crouch, spear held high. He took a single step forward, anchoring his foot in a firm patch of snow, muscles bracing. His heart pounded, but his mind was calm. He exhaled slowly. Then he threw. The spear flew through the frigid air, its flint point glinting with a sliver of sunlight. It struck true, just behind the front shoulder, where the ribs parted enough for a clean kill. The young bull staggered, letting out a sharp, pained snort. The herd reacted instantly, animals bounding away in a roar of hooves and snow, but the hunters were already moving. They rushed forward, spears ready, aiming to finish the animal quickly and humanely. The bull collapsed after a brief struggle. The elder placed a steadying hand on its side as its breathing slowed. The hunters remained silent. This was not a moment for cheering or celebration, but for respect. They had taken a life, so their own could continue. When the bull fell still, the elder knelt and murmured a few quiet words, not a prayer in any formal sense, but a gesture of gratitude that had existed since immemorial, thanking the animal, thanking the land, acknowledging the balance that allowed them to survive. Only then did the hunters begin their work. They moved with swift, practiced efficiency. The hide was cut, peeled, and laid aside for tanning. The best cuts of meat were separated immediately to be carried back. Tendons were removed to dry into strong cord. Even the bones would be used later for tools and weapons. Nothing could be wasted here, not in the Ice Age, where every part of the animal was precious. Up on the hill, the children watched the distant figures bend over at the sight, busy with purposeful movements. The youngest girl tugged at her mother's sleeve and whispered, "Did they do it?" The woman smiled softly and nodded. "Yes," she answered, voice warm but quiet. "Tonight we eat well." And as the hunters finished preparing their load, the sky began to darken with early winter dusk. They strapped bundles of meat and hide to their shoulders, ready for the journey back. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of snow and the promise of a cold night ahead. But the family would face that night with strength, with warmth, and with gratitude, for the hunt had succeeded, and the ancient rhythm of survival continued
just as it had for countless generations before them.
The return journey from the valley was slow but steady, as the hunters retraced their steps across the snow-covered terrain. Each carried precious bundles of meat, bone, and hide, weighty loads, but carried with pride. The young hunter felt the ache in his shoulders, yet his heart was light. The successful hunt meant safety, nourishment, and security for the group. It was a quiet victory, the kind that was celebrated not with noise, but with gratitude and rest. By the time they reached the temporary camp, the sky had shifted into deeper hues of evening gray. The women and children saw them first, returning as dark silhouettes against the glowing horizon. The youngest child clapped her small mitt-covered hands, unable to contain her excitement, while the elder woman allowed herself a small smile of relief. Food in the Ice Age was never taken for granted. Every successful hunt meant more days of strength ahead, more time to grow, heal, and carry on. As tradition dictated, the hunters approached the fire before they began to unload their burdens. The elder woman tossed a small pinch of dried herbs into the flames, which crackled and sent up a delicate smoke. It was a simple ritual, one that existed in many variations across countless generations. Whether understood as calling on spirits or honoring the land itself, it reminded everyone present that life was a balance between taking and giving. Then the work began. Even though darkness was falling, there was much to do before the cold deepened. The hunters laid the meat on clean hides to keep it from the snow, and the women immediately began preparing strips for preservation. They cut carefully, separating thick muscles into long, thin pieces that would dry more easily. When smoked over low flames or laid in sun and wind over the next days, these strips would become lean, nutrient-dense food that could last for weeks or even months. The children watched with fascination, some helping turn the meat or wipe knives clean. Even the smallest child was trusted with small tasks, carrying twigs, fetching water, stacking scraps that would later become tools, glue, or thread. In this world, there were no idle hands. Purpose was given early, and it helped shape identity, discipline, and belonging. Meanwhile, the elder man and the younger hunter set aside specific parts of the animal for immediate use. The liver, nutritious and rich, was prized and eaten fresh. Some bones were cracked open to extract the marrow, a high-energy food perfect for restoring fatigue after a long day. As the meal cooked, the hunters took time to clean their weapons. Spears were wiped down, blood flints scraped clean, sinew bindings checked for looseness. The elder inspected the young hunter's spear carefully. The throw had been clean, the strike true. He nodded, a gesture of rare and meaningful approval. The young man felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the fire. Nearby, the older woman worked on the hide, scraping away fat and membrane with a stone tool, preparing it for tanning. The hide of a reindeer was precious. In a world of freezing winds and endless cold, fur clothing was life-saving equipment. With time and effort, this hide could become strong boots, a sleeping cover, a warm coat, or a lining for the inside of a shelter. The camp filled with the smells of roasting meat, burning pine, and fresh snow on the air. Shadows flickered on stone and hides as the fire grew stronger, a living heart beating at the center of their survival. When the food was ready, it was shared in silence at first. The first bites after a hunt were always taken with quiet appreciation. They chewed slowly, savoring the rich taste and the strength returning to their bodies. Hunger was never forgotten in this age, and every meal reminded them of the delicate balance upon which life rested. Only after the first moments of eating did the conversations begin. The children peppered the young hunter with questions, wide-eyed. How far was the herd? Were they frightened? Did the spear fly straight? He answered patiently,
describing the land, the approach, the throw, not boasting, but teaching. In passing his experience on, he was continuing a chain centuries long. The older man shared his observations as well, how the wind had cooperated, how the valley's formation had offered perfect cover. These quiet lessons were as important as any weapon. Knowledge was the true inheritance in this world. When their bellies were full, the camp settled into the calm of evening. The children curled under warm furs, their faces rosy from food and fire. The adults spoke softly, planning the next day. They would stay near this temporary camp while the bulk of the meat was processed. The herd was still nearby, so another hunt might be possible soon. Weather signs showed snow in the coming days, so speed and efficiency were essential. Above them, the sky opened in a cascade of stars, brighter than anything the modern world would ever see. The Milky Way arched like a river of frozen light, flowing silently from one horizon to the other. The young woman leaned back and watched it, feeling small yet connected to something vast beyond understanding. As the fire slowly burned down, one by one, the group drifted toward rest. The last flickers of light danced across stone and hides, illuminating faces now peaceful with accomplishment. The night was cold. The world was harsh. But here, in this tiny pocket of warmth and cooperation, there was comfort. Not the comfort of abundance, but the comfort of unity, of purpose shared, of another day survived. Tomorrow would bring more work, more challenges, more learning. But tonight they slept with full stomachs, warm bodies, and hearts strengthened by the knowledge that they had faced the Ice Age together and prevailed once again.
Night passed slowly. Outside the rock shelter, the snowfall deepened, muffling the world in layers of white silence. Winds swept across the tundra in long sighs. But inside the camp, there was stillness. The warm stillness of breathing bodies curled beneath thick hides, of a fire smoldering in glowing embers, of a world temporarily held at bay. Before dawn had fully risen, the elder man awoke. His joints ached in the cold, as they often did, but he accepted the pain without complaint. In a life shaped by the Ice Age, discomfort was a constant visitor. He sat up, took a moment to steady himself, and then moved quietly to the fire, feeding it small pieces of dried wood until the flames flickered back to life. He listened to the world outside. A stillness, a soft hiss of falling snow. No distant howls, no urgent signs of predators. Good. Today would be challenging enough without added dangers. Soon the others stirred. The young hunter rose next, rubbing the stiffness from his shoulders. He had slept light, knowing that today, perhaps, another hunt would begin. He approached the fire and sat beside the elder, who handed him a hot stone wrapped in hide, a warming gesture and a wordless sign of respect. Breakfast was simple: slivers of dried meat and a thick broth made from bone and snowmelt. The children drank theirs while still half asleep, their cheeks pink from the warmth. Even in the harshest of climes, there was gentleness in moments like these. As the light grew outside, the group prepared. Those staying behind began carefully arranging the drying rack beneath the rock overhang, placing the meat in wide strips, spaced apart so the cold, dry air could circulate freely. The older woman examined each piece with practiced eyes. Any slice too thick might not dry in time and could spoil. Efficiency was survival. The young woman tended to the hide stretched on the wooden frame. She scraped steadily, removing remaining tissue, until the surface looked clean and smooth. Her hands were skillful despite the cold numbing her fingers. With every scrape, the hide came closer to becoming clothing, blankets, or shelter walls, material that could make the difference between life and death in a freezing storm. Meanwhile, the hunters readied their weapons. The young hunter checked the bindings on his spear again. The flint blade glinted in the weak morning light, sharp, carefully shaped, deadly. His companion prepared a bow and several arrows, the tips made from sharpened bone or small flint flakes. Each weapon was humble in appearance, yet the result of generations of refinement. Before they left, the elder tightened the young hunter's shoulder strap and looked into his eyes, an unspoken reminder. Be patient. Be observant. Respect the land that provides. The young hunter nodded, absorbing the message without either of them needing to speak. Then they stepped out into the cold. The snow was deeper than yesterday, fresh and powdery, shifting under their feet. But this was no obstacle. They were experienced, and they knew how to move lightly, conserving energy, staying silent. Their breath misted in the air as they walked, the vast whiteness stretching ahead of them like a frozen ocean. As they followed the slope toward the valley, the world felt enormous. The Ice Age had reshaped the land into sweeping plains, jagged peaks, and wind-carved ridges. Trees were sparse, stunted by the cold, and the sky loomed large above them, an endless dome of gray and white. Tracks appeared in the snow, broad, deep impressions leading toward the distant valley. Reindeer. The herd had moved but not gone far. The hunters exchanged satisfied glances. This was promising. They crouched and examined the tracks. Fresh, likely only hours old. The animals were moving steadily, not at a panicked pace. That meant they were calm and grazing, not fleeing predators. Continuing onward, they passed through a narrow pass where wind sculpted the snow into tall, smooth drifts. The young hunter ran his gloved fingers along the edge, marveling at how the snow formed patterns like waves frozen in mid-motion. The land was harsh, yet beautiful. When they reached a low ridge, they paused and peered over. There, below them, the herd grazed among frost-covered shrubs. 20 dozen reindeer, heads down, moving slowly across the valley. A few calves stayed close to their mothers, while a massive bull stood watch at the edge of the group, his antlers like a crown of ice. The hunters' hearts quickened. Not with fear, but a respectful focus. They studied the wind, they studied the terrain, they studied the herd's position. The elder lessons echoed in the young hunter's mind. The land tells you how to succeed if you listen. The two men crouched behind a snow-covered rock and quietly planned their approach. They would circle wide, using a slope as cover. The bowman would move ahead and find a vantage point, while the young hunter would position himself for a close throw. Nothing was guaranteed. Hunts could go wrong in a heartbeat. But they moved with the calm confidence of experience. They had done this many times, and the rhythm of the hunt was built into their bones. As they set off, crouched low and silent, the wind carried a faint wisp of snow across the valley. The reindeer grazed on, unaware. Back at the camp, the others continued their work, trusting the hunters, but never taking success for granted. The older woman hummed as she worked, an ancient melody with no known beginning, passed from mother to daughter across uncounted winters. In this world, life was uncertain, harsh, and fragile. But in that harshness, there was also purpose, connection, and meaning. The hunters crept closer. The herd grazed peacefully. And the Ice Age morning silently unfolded, waiting to see how the next chapter of survival would play out.
Dawn arrived quietly, with the pale glow of sunlight pressed against thick clouds. It did not burst over the horizon with brilliance. It seeped slowly into the world,
warming the sky from deep blue into a soft gray morning. Frost clung to every surface, coating the rocky shelter, the spears propped against the wall, and even the breath of those still sleeping. The camp began to stir. The first to awaken was the older woman. She had slept lightly, as she often did. Years of raising children and tending camps had tuned her instincts to every shift of wind and every distant sound. She sat up, pulled her fur cloak tighter, and moved toward the fire, where the embers still glowed a faint orange. With practiced hands, she fed the coals dried strips of moss and slivers of bark, coaxing the flames back to life until the fire crackled warmly once more. One by one, others rose, stretching, murmuring quietly, rubbing cold from their fingers and faces. The children, bundled beneath layers of hide, poked their heads out like small animals from burrows. Their breath puffed in small white plumes as they sleepily sat beside the fire and waited for warmth to reach their toes. The young hunter was awake soon after. The weight of responsibility still rested on his shoulders, not a burden, but a purpose. He checked his spear, ensuring the sinew still held tight, the flint still sharp. Though the hunt had been successful the day before, he knew that food never stayed long in such a cold world. The herd might still be in the valley, and every opportunity had to be taken. But today, not everyone would hunt. Much of the group stayed to continue preparing the reindeer. The hide needed scraping, the meat drying, and the bones boiling to extract glue and fat. Every part of the animal would be used. Nothing was left behind, not fur, not sinew, not marrow, not hoof. In this world, waste was a luxury no one could afford. The children helped as best they could. One boy collected snow and melted it in a heated stone bowl for drinking. Another gathered twigs, snapping them into smaller, usable pieces. The smallest girl sat beside her mother, sorting the reindeer's bones by size. Her mother touched her hair gently. This was how knowledge passed, not in great lessons, but in simple tasks shared. The elder man prepared a frame from bent branches and rawhide to stretch the hide. He showed the younger hunter how to pull the skin tight, how to anchor it firmly in the frozen ground so that it would dry flat and strong. These skills were as essential as hunting itself. A poorly treated hide could stiffen or rot, and warmth was life. By midday, the younger hunter and one companion were ready to scout again. Not a full hunt, just observation. The herd's patterns were changing, and understanding their movement could mean the difference between abundance and scarcity in the coming weeks. The elder nodded as the young man set off, his footsteps muffled by thick snow, his silhouette fading into the white world. Back at camp, work continued, steady and rhythmic. The older woman boiled bones in a stone-lined pit filled with hot water, adding heated rocks to keep the liquid simmering. She watched for the surface sheen that meant valuable fat rising, energy they could store or cook with. The young woman sat nearby, smoothing strips of meat with her flint scraper so they would dry faster. The air smelled of smoke, hide, and winter wind. A few hours later, snow began to fall, soft at first, then heavier. Large flakes drifted down like slow-moving feathers, landing on hair, hides, and fire-warmed stones, where they vanished with a soft hiss. The children stuck out their tongues, giggling, and the older woman laughed, shaking her head in fond amusement. The young woman looked up at the sky with furrowed brow. Heavy snowfall could change everything. Visibility, hunting, travel. For now, though, they had shelter and fire. They were prepared. By late afternoon, the scouts returned. The herd had moved slightly, but was still within reach. The snow would make tracking easier in some ways, harder in others. The elder listened carefully, considering. Then he gave a simple nod. They would hunt again soon, before the weather worsened. The Ice Age offered opportunities, but it did not wait for comfort. As evening descended, the snow thickened, blanketing the world in silence. The camp gathered inside the rock shelter, their fire a warm heart amid the frozen land. They ate dried meat, boiled marrow, and a handful of berries saved from warmer days. It was not a feast, but it was enough, and enough was everything. After dinner, the elder spoke in a low voice, telling the children a story, one they had heard before and would hear many times again. It was about a young hunter long ago who had faced a winter even harsher than this one, who had watched the rivers freeze solid and the mammoths disappear deeper south. He had despaired until he learned that survival was not about strength alone, but about patience, cooperation, and learning from the land itself. The children listened, eyes wide, as the snow whispered against the rocks outside. The story was comfort, not because it promised a world without hardship, but because it reminded them that others had faced the ice and survived. As the flames burned low and the camp settled into quiet dreams, the wind outside picked up, swirling drifts of snow into soft dunes against the shelter. But inside, the small group slept warm, protected by fire, fur, and the shared knowledge of generations. In a world of endless winter, the strength of community was their greatest fire.
Evening deepened into night, and though the hunters had returned safely, their work was far from finished. The new meat had to be processed, tools cleaned and hides stretched, all before the cold could claim any of it. Yet, for a short while, after everyone had eaten, the camp settled into a kind of peaceful hum. The fire glowed bright beneath the rock overhang, filling the shelter with amber light. Snow drifted outside in gentle swirls, and the sky above the darkness glittered faintly with stars hidden behind thin clouds. One by one, the group settled into their evening tasks. The older woman worked beside the fire with practiced grace, trimming sinew from the fresh reindeer legs. Sinew was precious, strong, flexible, and durable. Once dried and twisted, it became the thread that bound spearheads, fastened clothing, and held tools together. She hummed softly as she worked, her song as old as winter itself. Nearby, the young woman soaked strips of hide in warmed water. Her fingers moved steadily, softening the stiff skin so she could scrape it clean the next day. When she paused to warm her hands, the older woman smiled gently. Life was harsh in the Ice Age, but there were still small comforts, shared glances, shared songs, shared warmth. The men cleaned their weapons. The bowman repaired a cracked arrow shaft, heating it gently over the fire before straightening it. The young hunter scraped dried blood from his spear and inspected the flint point. It had performed well, but one edge had chipped during the throw. With delicate taps of a stone hammer, he began reshaping it, tiny flakes shimmering like ice as they fell. The elder man watched him with quiet approval. "You strike too hard on the third pass," the elder murmured, guiding him. "I know," the young hunter replied, adjusting his grip. And with each correction, the spearhead sharpened, his skill growing with it. Meanwhile, the children, now full and warm, settled around the fire listening to small tales and short jokes. One boy practiced carving shapes into a piece of antler with a blunt tool. His mother helped guide his hand, teaching him how to hold the tool safely, how to scrape away small layers instead of hacking at them. Outside the shelter, darkness expanded and the cold grew sharper. But the fire kept the group safe, its glow reaching all the way to their hearts. Survival in this world wasn't just about food or shelter, it was about rhythm, the rhythm of daily work, of cooperation, of knowledge passing from one generation to the next. Later, when most of the chores were done, the elder man called everyone close to the fire. This was their nightly ritual, one that existed for reasons deeper than sleep or safety. In the Ice Age, the hours of darkness were long, and stories were a way of keeping minds warm when bodies could not be. Tonight's story was one the children loved. "It happened long before you were born," the elder began, his voice low and calm. "In a winter colder than this one, colder than any your grandparents remember." The children leaned close, eyes shining. There was a hunter, a young man who lived alone in the far north. He was strong and skilled, but proud. He believed he needed no one, not the guidance of elders, not the help of his kin, not the wisdom of the land. The fire cracked, sending sparks upward like tiny stars. One winter, the animals did not return to his hunting grounds. He traveled far, farther than he ever had, but found nothing. The cold grew sharper, the winds fierce. Still he pressed on, thinking himself strong enough to face the winter alone. The young hunter listened with special attention. These stories held lessons meant for him too. But no one survives winter alone. Not man, not beast. The elder's voice softened. The young hunter collapsed in a valley of deep snow. He could not move, and he knew the end was near. But just as the dark closed in, he saw figures approaching, members of a neighboring family, traveling with their sleds. They took him in, fed him, shared their fire. And when spring came, he was no longer alone. Silence wrapped the group for a moment. "What did he learn?" the youngest child whispered. "That strength is not in standing alone, but in standing together." The children nodded solemnly, absorbing the truth. Even the adults let the message settle within them. In this land of ice and wind, community was not just comforting, it was essential. The night wore on, and slowly, one by one, the group prepared for sleep. They piled extra wood near the fire, placed stones warmed by the flames beneath their furs, and nestled close to share heat. The young hunter lingered a moment longer, listening to the quiet breaths of those he cared for. The elder's story echoed in his mind. Strength was not the spear in his hand or the muscle in his arm. It was this: the people who shared this fire, this shelter, this life. Outside, the snow thickened. The wind swept over the world like a cold, ancient sigh. But inside the shelter, wrapped in warmth and the soft glow of firelight, the group slept in peace. Tomorrow, the Ice Age would test them again. But tonight, they rested. Together.
Morning broke quietly. The storm of the previous night had passed, leaving behind a world softened and silenced by deep snow. The sky was pale, washed clean of clouds, and the first hints of golden light glimmered on distant peaks. The cold was sharp, but beautiful, the kind that made the air shimmer with frost. Before anyone else stirred, the young woman stepped outside the shelter. She breathed slowly, letting the cold sting her lungs before exhaling in a soft cloud. The land stretched wide in front of her, pristine, white, untouched. She closed her eyes briefly and listened. No wind, no wolves, just peace. Inside the shelter, the others began waking. The fire was coaxed back into brightness, and everyone held their hands open to the warmth as they shook off the last of sleep. Today was not a day for hunting. Today was for work that kept the group strong through the long winter. Drying meat, shaping tools, preparing clothing and shelter, repairing anything worn by the cold.
The older woman handed out slices of dried meat for breakfast. The children ate theirs eagerly, laughing quietly at a joke one of them had just invented. Laughter, even small and quiet, was precious in the Ice Age. It reminded everyone that life was not just survival, it was also living. Soon after breakfast, tasks began. The young woman returned to her stretched hide, now firm and ready. She scraped carefully, cleaning every inch until the surface was smooth. Later, she would rub it with fish oil or animal brains, materials that softened and preserved the hide, making it flexible and weather-resistant. Nearby, the older woman continued drying sinew over a small secondary fire. She watched it closely, not too close to flame, not too far away. She tested a strip, bending it slightly. It flexed without snapping. Good. When finished, it would be twisted into powerful thread, stronger than anything made of plant fibers. The young hunter and the bowman sat slightly apart, repairing weapons. The young man chipped new flakes into his spearhead, improving it after the previous day's hunt. The arrows of the bowman were laid neatly beside him as he tested shafts for straightness by rolling them along a smooth stone. Every tool mattered. Every detail could mean life or death. Later, the elder man took the young hunter aside. They walked a short distance from camp, where a small ridge overlooked the valley they had hunted in. The elder stopped and pointed at the distant snow-covered expanses. "You see how the land curves down there?" he asked. The young hunter nodded. He continued, "That valley has water beneath it. Not now, not in this freeze, but in warmer seasons. That's why the herds return there every year." The young hunter realized this was more than conversation. It was teaching. It was passing on knowledge earned through decades of living with the land. The elder continued, "Food is never random. The herds are animals of habit. If you understand their needs, water, shelter, grazing, you can find them, even in the harshest winter." The young hunter listened intently. These lessons, too, were part of survival. Back at camp, a new project had begun. Using heated stones and snowmelt, the older woman was preparing glue from reindeer hooves and bones. When finished, it would be thick and sticky, perfect for reinforcing spear points or binding wooden joints. She showed one of the children how to stir the mixture slowly, teaching yet another small skill that might someday mean survival. As the sun rose higher, the camp's energy grew. The children practiced drills with small wooden spears, laughing and trying to imitate the adults' hunting stances. Their movements were clumsy, but full of enthusiasm. One day those little limbs would gain strength, and those games would become skill. By midday, the young woman had finished preparing the hide. She held it up to inspect it. It was beautiful in its way, soft, pale, and strong. She imagined it as a winter coat, or perhaps a sleeping blanket to keep a child warm. She smiled, knowing that her work meant warmth for someone she cared about. The elder returned to the camp with the young hunter. As they sat by the fire, the elder continued his teaching. "One day, I won't be here," he said simply. "The land will need someone who understands it." The young hunter didn't respond immediately. The weight of those words settled like fresh snow. But he nodded slowly. He said, "I'm learning." The elder smiled. "That is all anyone can do." Later, a short break allowed the group to rest, eat a few berries preserved from summer, and warm their hands. Even rest was part of survival. Bodies needed time to recover if they were to endure the winter. As evening approached, work resumed. The group smoked more strips of meat over the fire, stacking them carefully to maximize airflow.
Some meat would feed them for weeks, some would be carried with them when they moved camp again. The young woman began sewing new boots for one of the children, stitching furs together with sinew thread and a bone needle. She worked with swift precision, the same hands that scraped hides, sharpened tools, and carried wood. In this world, skill diversity was strength. Everyone did everything: hunt, sew, build, scrape, carry, plan, teach, and learn. As the light faded and temperature fell again, the group gathered near the fire for the evening meal. Tonight they ate broth, thickened with marrow and root starch, giving much-needed energy. Steam curled upward in fragrant spirals. The children leaned against the adults, tired from a full day of activity. The night softened into calm. The crackling of the fire and the rhythmic scraping of sewing needles were the only sounds. The snow outside glittered under the first appearance of the moon. No hunt today, no story tonight, no danger on the wind. Just the quiet of community, the slow work that kept them strong, the small but powerful peace of a single safe day in a world that offered few. And as the group settled beneath their blankets of hide and fur, the fire crackled softly, promising warmth, promising another morning, promising that in the Ice Age, life went on, one day, one task, one lesson at a time.
Night had settled fully, and with it came the kind of silence that did not feel empty but comforting. The snow outside reflected the pale light of the moon, turning the world silver and still. Inside the shelter, most of the group slept. Only the embers of the fire continued their soft breathing glow, pulsing like a heartbeat in the dark. But not everyone had gone to sleep. The young woman sat awake beside the fire, stitching the last seams of the small child's boots. Her eyes were heavy, but she worked slowly and patiently, repeating motions she could almost do in her sleep. She had learned long ago that work done at night brought a different kind of peace, when the world was quiet and her thoughts moved gently like the flicker of the flames. After a while she rested her hands, turning her head slightly as she heard soft movement nearby. The elder woman, too, was awake. "You should rest," the elder murmured quietly, sitting down beside her. "I will," the young woman replied, tying off one final knot. The elder watched her for a long moment. She saw the steady concentration, the careful way the young woman handled the hide, the pride in her expression despite the exhaustion. "You've grown skilled. Work like that shows care, and care is what keeps us alive." The young woman smiled at the compliment. Praise was rare and therefore precious. When the work was finally done, she set the boots near the fire to soften and warm before morning. The two women sat side by side in companionable silence, the kind that needed no words. For a moment, the young woman looked beyond the firelight to the shadowed corners of the shelter, where the others slept. The children bundled under furs, curled together for warmth. The hunters sprawled with limbs heavy from the previous day's effort. The elder man resting quietly, face calm and peaceful. This was their world, small, fragile, but held together with shared labor and shared hope. After a few minutes, the elder woman spoke again, her voice soft and thoughtful. "When I was young, I thought winter was the enemy. I feared the cold, the snow, the endless dark. But I learned something over the years." The young woman turned to listen. "Winter is not only a trial, it is also a teacher. It reminds us what matters, who we are, what we must protect. Summer can make one careless. Winter never does. The young woman absorbed those words the way children absorb the warmth of a fire, quietly, fully, without needing to respond. Outside, the wind returned in a faint whisper. It rustled through the snow-covered branches, but not with the violence of a storm, more like a gentle sigh, as if the world itself was settling deeper into sleep. After a time, the elder woman stood. "Now you should rest," she said softly. "Tomorrow will ask new things of us." They exchanged a brief smile, warm despite the cold all around them. The elder went back to her sleeping place and wrapped herself beneath heavy hides. The young woman stretched out her hands toward the last warmth of the fire before finally lying down and pulling a fur over herself. Her muscles eased, her breathing slowed, and she felt sleep approach like the slow fall of snowflakes, peaceful, soft, inevitable. Hours later, well past midnight, a few sparks flared from the dying embers, breaking the darkness for just a moment. The camp was utterly still. Even the wind had fallen silent again. But far away, miles beyond the ridge, beyond frozen streams and rock outcrops, something else was awake. A herd of shaggy steppe bison moved slowly across the moonlit snow, their breath puffing in silver clouds. Ice crusted their thick coats, and each hoofstep sank heavily into the powder. They were migrating, following the very patterns the elder had taught the young hunter earlier that day. They were searching for sparse patches of winter grass, guided by instinct older than memory. Their presence meant something important. Opportunity, food, a future. By morning, the group would discover fresh tracks in the snow, and life would continue. One cycle feeding into the next, just as the earth itself kept slowly revolving beneath a frozen sky. For now, though, dreams ruled the shelter, and outside, the world slept with them, quiet, still, waiting for the next day to dawn.
Dawn arrived slowly, as if reluctant to disturb the deep quiet of the night. The first thin streaks of color, soft pinks, silver grays, and barely there gold, touched the sky. The world outside the shelter shone with crystalline stillness, every surface crusted in delicate frost that sparkled like scattered diamonds. Inside the shelter, the fire had burned down to quiet coals, glowing in the dim. One by one, the group stirred from sleep, stretching under fur blankets and rubbing warmth back into numb fingers. The young hunter woke with a sense of urgency he could not name. He stepped outside and inhaled sharply, his breath freezing in the air. The cold was deep, even sharper than the day before, but the sky was clear, a good sign for travel or a hunt. He moved a few steps away from the shelter and froze. Tracks, fresh, large, and numerous. He knelt, brushing snow aside carefully. The impressions were wide, rounded, and deep, far too large for wolves or deer. His eyes traced a line of them stretching off toward the distant ridge. A herd. Close. Very close. He stood quickly and hurried back inside. The elder man was already awake, quietly feeding dried wood chips into the remaining coals to rekindle the fire. He looked up with a calm but knowing expression. "You've seen something," the elder said quietly. "The herd," the young hunter replied, breath visible in short clouds. "They passed nearby during the night." The elder nodded, as though he had been expecting exactly this moment. "Gather the others." Soon the shelter was alive with movement.
The hunters readied themselves with quiet efficiency, checking spear bindings, selecting the strongest arrows, tightening belt straps. The older woman handed each of them a small piece of dried meat for energy. No words of luck were spoken. In this world, success depended on skill, preparation, and the favor of the landscape, not on superstition or ceremony. Before the hunters left, the young woman pressed a newly sewn boot into the small child's hand. The child grinned, wiggling fingers in delight before bundling up tightly again. The young woman then stepped outside to join the elder woman in preparing the camp for the day ahead. The hunters moved out quietly, their silhouettes shrinking against the rising sun. As they walked, snow crunched beneath their fur-wrapped feet, leaving a trail that would soon be covered by drifting flakes. They followed the tracks for nearly half a mile, until the land opened into a wide, frozen valley, and there, just where the elder had predicted, stood the herd. Massive steppe bison grazed among patches of exposed winter grass, their steaming breaths rising like pale ghosts into the morning air. They moved slowly, heavily, their thick coats swaying with each step. The hunters knelt behind a low ridge and watched. The young hunter felt his pulse steady. This was no ordinary sight. This was an opportunity that could feed the group for weeks. The elder man spoke softly, his voice barely louder than a whisper. "Patience. We choose our moment." The hunters waited, observing how the wind moved, where the herd shifted, which animals stood isolated, where the snow was firm or deep. Every detail mattered. A misstep could mean a lost hunt or worse. Meanwhile, back at camp, the young woman and elder woman had begun their own work. They lit small fires to melt snow for drinking water. They laid out bone knives and scrapers, preparing for the possibility of butchering later in the day. The children gathered wood, quick and energetic, eager to do their part. Inside the shelter, the older woman hummed softly, checking weapons, organizing sinew threads, and ensuring cooking stones were set aside for heating. This was their version of readiness: quiet, skilled, steady. In the valley, the elder finally gave a small nod. The hunters spread out slowly, moving like shadows against the white. The young hunter felt the cold wind sting his face, but inside, his thoughts were firm and focused. He adjusted his grip on the spear. Nearby, the bowman notched an arrow, eyes narrowed. The bison continued grazing, unaware. A single breath passed. Then another. Then the moment came. A low grunt from the elder was the signal. The hunters sprang into motion. The bowman released his arrow with a soft thrum, and the spear left the young hunter's hand a heartbeat later. The air split with sudden motion. The herd exploded into panic, massive hooves thundering across the snow. One bison staggered, wounded, separated from the others as the hunters sprinted forward for the chase. Their voices echoed in the cold air, controlled and sharp, calling positions and warnings. This was not chaos. This was practiced precision. Humans working together, bodies and minds linked by shared necessity. The wounded bison turned sharply, kicking snow into the air. The young hunter lunged, grabbing his backup spear. The others circled, moving like wolves around a giant. And in that frozen valley, under a rising sun, the long dance of hunt and survival began. A ritual older than memory, older than speech itself. What happened next would shape the coming days. Success meant warmth, strength, and full bellies. Failure meant hunger and hardship. But for now, as the herd thundered and the hunters pressed forward, there was only the moment itself, sharp, focused, alive in the Ice Age world.
The air trembled with the power of the herd. Snow flew in great clouds beneath pounding hooves, and the bison's bellows rolled across the valley like echoes from ancient mountains. But the hunters did not falter. They had faced this moment many times before. They understood the rhythm of the chase. The wounded bison veered away from the others, its instinct driving it to break free of pursuit. Steam poured from its nostrils, dark eyes wild with pain and fear. The young hunter and his companions followed, feet digging into the snow, breaths coming in sharp bursts as they ran. The elder moved slightly behind, his steps sure and unwavering. Though his age had slowed him, his mind was as sharp as the spear points carried by the young men. He watched angles, wind, terrain, seeing possibilities where others saw only speed and chaos. The young hunter closed the gap, his heart pounding so intensely he felt it in his teeth. Snow stung his face and cold air burned deep in his chest, but he did not let up. Hunting in the Ice Age was not a matter of perfection. It was a matter of endurance, strategy, and the will to continue. At just the right moment, the bowman positioned himself on a slight rise. His breath steadied. He drew the fletching to his cheek, sighting along the arrow shaft. For a heartbeat, the world seemed still. Then, thrum, the arrow flew. It struck true, embedding in the bison's flank. The great animal stumbled, slowed, and the young hunter rushed forward, spear in hand. He aimed carefully, avoiding the thickest hide and bone. His throw was strong, but not enough to finish the job. The bison bellowed again, turning sharply. The snow churned beneath its hooves as it spun and charged, not away, but toward them. For a moment, time stretched thin. The ground shook. The hunters braced. The young hunter's pulse roared in his ears. Then the elder moved. With calm precision born of decades of survival, he stepped aside at the last possible instant and drove his spear downward with both hands, striking deep at the base of the animal's neck, a vital point where hide was thinner and protection weaker. The impact jolted his arms, but his stance held firm. The bison staggered, strength failing. A second hunter rushed in, finishing with a quick and merciful strike. Silence followed. Only the wind spoke. The bison sank slowly to its knees, then to the ground, breath fading in clouds of steam. The hunters lowered their weapons. No one cheered, no one shouted. That was not the way of their world. The moment was solemn, a recognition of the life taken and the life given. The young hunter placed a hand on the great animal's shoulder, eyes lowered. "Thank you," he whispered. The others echoed the gesture in their own quiet ways, touch, thought, breath. They knew that without animals like this, humans could not survive. Respect was not a ritual. It was truth. After a moment, the elder straightened and spoke in a low voice. "We must work quickly. Heat leaves the body fast." They set to the task with practiced efficiency. The knives were unwrapped, stone blades carefully sharpened to razor edges. The young hunter made the first incision along the thick hide, steam rising as warm flesh met frozen air. The smell of iron and earth filled the valley. They worked methodically, slicing through hide, splitting muscle, removing organs, separating meat into transportable sections. The bowmen gathered intestines for later use, thread, cord, storage. Another hunter collected bones, knowing they would later be cracked for rich marrow. Nothing of the animal would be wasted. Meanwhile, back at camp, the young woman paused in her sewing. She felt the strange shift of intuition, a quiet awareness that something had changed. She looked toward the horizon, eyes squinting against reflected light.
The elder woman, sharpening tools, noticed. "You feel it?" she asked. The young woman nodded. "They succeeded," she said softly. Faith in the hunters was not blind faith. It was built on generations of skill, experience, and survival, even when luck played its part. The children sensed it too. Energy ran through the shelter like the flicker of a rising flame. They hopped in place, whispering excitedly. The older woman smiled. "Then let us be ready to welcome them." She began heating stones and melting snow, preparing for blood to wash, meat to cook, and hides to treat. The camp transformed from quiet waiting to focused readiness. Back in the valley, the hunters packed up their bounty. Heavy bundles of meat and hide were lashed with sinew, carried on shoulders and backs. The elder lifted a large section himself, not wanting to be spared labor just because of age. As they prepared to leave, the young hunter looked once more at the valley. The rest of the herd had vanished into the distance, dark shapes dissolving into the pale horizon. He inhaled deeply, feeling pride, relief, and the heavy calm of a duty fulfilled. Then, wordlessly, the group began the long walk back across the snow, footsteps careful, bodies leaning under the weight of precious food. When they crested the ridge, camp finally came into view. Smoke rose from small fires. Figures moved with purpose. The young woman stood outside, scanning the horizon. She saw them first. Her shoulders relaxed, and a small smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. The others followed her gaze, and soon the camp buzzed with quiet celebration, louder than any cheering. Warmth filled the shelter long before the hunters returned. The children raced to gather more firewood. Water simmered in cooking stones, flat stones heated in the flames, ready to sear meat. When the hunters finally stepped into camp, carrying their burden of survival, no words were needed. They were welcomed home by fire, by food, by relief, and by the knowledge that tonight nobody would sleep hungry. In the Ice Age, that was the greatest victory of all.
Evening settled gently over the snowbound landscape as the hunters returned to camp. The light was fading to soft violet, and the cold deepened, but the shelter glowed with warmth and life. Fires crackled, melting snow hissed on hot stones, and a deeply satisfying smell filled the air, rich, meaty, savory, the smell of abundance. The young woman hurried forward to take some of the heavy bundles from the hunters' backs. Her hands brushed the young hunter's arm, and for a moment their eyes met. Relief, pride, and quiet gratitude exchanged without a word. The older woman guided the children aside. "Give them room," she murmured, though her voice held the rare warmth of joy. The children backed away, but could not help peeking around the corner, eyes wide as they watched the hunters lay down the day's harvest. Inside the shelter, small fires had been prepared. Smooth stones lay heating in the flames, and pots of melting snow shifted gently from icy to liquid. The elder woman placed a steaming stone into one of the large animal bladders filled with water, bringing it to a simmer, one of the most ancient ways of cooking, older than pottery itself. Soon, strips of fresh meat were placed on the hot stones, sizzling in the firelight. The first bites always went to the hunters, those whose bodies had spent their strength out in the cold. But tonight, no one had to wait long. There was plenty. The young hunter ate slowly at first, savoring each warm mouthful. The food soothed the burning ache in his lungs and eased the shaking in his legs. The bowman grinned and passed a small cooked piece to a child, who bit into it with visible delight, grease running down his chin. For the first time in days, Laughter drifted through the shelter, soft, tired, but real. Meanwhile, the adults continued their work. In the Ice Age, even success meant more work to do. The young woman and older woman began the careful process of treating the hide. The fresh skin was stretched out and scraped again, removing every bit of flesh and membrane. It was hard labor, hands stiffening in the cold, but they worked steadily. A well-prepared hide could become winter boots, insulated coats, shelter coverings, blankets for the coldest nights. Across the shelter, the elder man split the long leg bones with a sharp stone wedge and mallet. The snap rang out in the quiet, and rich, thick marrow spilled forth. He scooped some of the warm marrow onto a flat stone and passed it around. A child took a lick and squeaked with delight. "A good for little bones," the older woman chuckled, tapping the child's shoulder. She wasn't wrong. Marrow was pure energy, and in winter, energy was everything. As the evening deepened, the group fell into tasks that matched their strengths. One hunter cleaned and straightened the bison sinews. Another began cutting jerky strips for long-term storage. The bowman removed the arrowheads from broken shafts to sharpen and reuse later. Children collected snow in large hide containers, carrying it back inside for water. Every person contributed. This was the strength of their world. Not individuals alone, but community woven tightly together. With bellies now warm and full, a comfortable quiet settled over the shelter. The little firelight flickered against the walls, making the painted charcoal shapes, simple animals and hunters, seem to dance. The young woman finished her share of hide work and finally allowed herself to sit. Her arms trembled faintly from effort. She wrapped her fingers around a warm piece of stone and placed it against her sore muscles. The elder woman noticed the fatigue in her face. "You worked as hard as any hunter today," she said gently. The young woman shrugged, though a smile played at the corner of her mouth. "We all did." Outside, the night stretched wide and silent. The stars shimmered sharply in the clear winter sky. Thousands of them, glittering like frost crystals across the heavens. The cold was intense, the kind that bit right through fur, but inside, the shelter held heat like a living hearth. As preparations continued, the elder man finally spoke, addressing the young hunter in a quiet tone. "You saw how the herd moved today. You understood when the moment was right." The young hunter nodded, humbled by the acknowledgement. "Skill grows slowly," the elder continued, "but today it grew again." There was no higher praise in their world. Later still, with much of the work complete, the group began to relax. The older woman sprinkled herbs into a pot of broth, roots collected long ago, saved for moments when spirits and bodies needed soothing. The smell was earthy, calming, reminiscent of distant forests and seasons untouched by snow. When the broth was ready, she ladled small portions into carved wooden cups. One by one, each person sipped, feeling warmth travel from tongue to heart to limbs, driving away the cold that had followed them all day. A soft quiet followed. Children leaned against adults. Hunters stretched out tired muscles. The fire glowed steady, content, alive. The young woman looked around the shelter, at faces softened by firelight, at hands resting finally after a day of struggle and success, at the subtle peace that only came when necessity had been met. In the Ice Age, they did not know luxuries, but they knew something many people in easier times forgot: the deep happiness found in enough. Enough food,
enough warmth, enough life to greet tomorrow. Outside, the northern wind whispered over the snow, but inside, the shelter felt like a world unto itself, a bubble of fire, family, and survival. As the last tasks finished and the fire settled into quiet embers, the group lay down again beneath their hides. Sleep approached slowly, soft, heavy, warm. And across the frozen land, the stars glittered on, patient and eternal, watching the small but determined humans who carried their glowing fire through the darkness of the Ice Age.
The long night passed quietly, and when morning came, it did so without hurry. A faint silver glow crept across the shelter walls, signaling the rise of a new winter day. No wind howled, no snow fell. The world outside seemed to be holding its breath in peaceful stillness. Inside the shelter, the fire was already awake. A few of the adults had risen early, feeding the faint coals with slivers of wood and dried brush until the flame stretched upward again, casting warm light across resting faces. The children remained asleep, curled tightly beneath fur blankets, their small breaths soft and steady. The young woman rose slowly, her muscles sore, but her spirit restored by a night of deep sleep and a full stomach. She stretched her arms and stepped outside into the morning air. The cold kissed her cheeks sharply, but it no longer felt threatening. A full camp and fresh supplies turned even the harshest weather into something manageable. The sky overhead was pale blue, tinted with the soft pink of dawn. The snow glittered untouched, except for the trail of footprints and sled marks carved into it from the previous day's hunt. Those traces would soon be covered as the wind shifted and new snow drifted across the valley, erasing the past as nature always did. She knelt and brushed her fingers across the snow. It felt firmer this morning, hard-packed by nighttime cold, which meant it would be easier for travel and hauling. A good sign. Winter rarely offered gifts, but today felt like one. Behind her, the elder woman emerged from the shelter with a basket woven from plant fibers gathered seasons ago. Inside were strips of half-dried meat. She gave the young woman a small nod. Today we finish the smoking. By nightfall, the stores will be strong again. The young woman smiled. There was satisfaction in that thought. In the Ice Age, survival didn't come from a single victory. It came from many small tasks completed with patience. Back inside, others were waking. The young hunter stretched stiff muscles before standing. The bruises from the previous day's chase were already darkening along his ribs and thigh, but he wore them with quiet pride. The elder noticed the marks and grunted approvingly. Pain is proof of effort. Let it remind you that skill is earned with the body. The young hunter nodded, understanding. Soon breakfast was handed out, warm broth and marrow spread on dried roots, simple but full of strength. The hunters ate with calm silence, conserving their energy for the work ahead. After the meal, the shelter buzzed again with purposeful activity. The men sharpened tools and cleaned their weapons for the next hunt. The older woman and young woman carried racks of drying meat out to the cold wind to finish dehydrating. One hunter prepared lengths of sinew and gut for future bowstrings and sewing. The children gathered wood close to camp, talking excitedly about the bison hunt, even though none of them had been there to witness it. But the morning's work brought something else. a sense of stability. For the first time in days, no one was desperate. No one worried about empty stomachs or dwindling supplies. Peace in this world was never permanent, but today at least it was real. Later in the morning, while the hide was drying and the meat racks were hung, the elder man called the young hunter aside. The two walked a short way beyond the shelter, stopping near a small rise that overlooked the snow-covered valley. He crouched and brushed snow from a patch of frozen ground. Beneath it, a scattering of crushed grass and hoof marks remained, the fading memory of yesterday's herd. He pressed a palm to the earth. "This land speaks," he said quietly. The young hunter crouched beside him. The elder pointed toward a line of dark rocks protruding from the snow. "Do you see how the snow gathers thicker on one side than the other? That tells you the wind usually comes from the west." He traced one hoofprint in the frost. "And this tells you the herd wasn't running blind, they were fleeing toward open ground." The young hunter nodded slowly, absorbing every detail. "In hunting, your weapon is not your spear, it is the land. If you know the land, then every animal, every movement, every pattern becomes clear." His voice softened. "One day I will not be here, and when that day comes, the land will need someone who can speak its language." The young hunter swallowed, realizing the weight of that responsibility. But he did not fear it. He felt ready, still learning, yes, but no longer a child taken along on hunts. He was becoming something more. Back at camp, the young woman and elder woman worked together to finish stretching the hide taken from the bison. They scraped the last bits of tissue from its surface, wiped it smooth with snow, and began rubbing it with a mixture of brains and warm water to soften it. The hide would take days to finish, but the women worked with patience. In the Ice Age, every long process was simply part of life. In the afternoon, the group gathered around the fire for a short rest. The children snacked on dried berries, while the older hunters passed around a piece of marrow to share. The young woman began sewing the first panel of what would become a thick winter coat. The young hunter helped trim sinew into usable strands, occasionally glancing up to watch her work. The cold deepened as the day moved toward evening, but no one shivered. Between the warmth of food, fire, and the busy movement of many hands, the cold remained outside. As sunset approached, the sky lit with brilliant color, fiery oranges and deep reds that burned across the horizon before disappearing into icy blue. The older woman paused in her smoking work to admire it. "Beautiful," she murmured. "Even winter has gifts." When night finally returned, the group settled again inside the shelter, embers glowing and stomachs full. The young hunter stretched out, bones aching in the best way. The young woman leaned against the shelter wall, her hands tired, but her heart quiet and content. Outside, the wind moved gently through the branches, but inside, all was warm, peaceful, and safe. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new hunts, new tasks, new lessons. But tonight, the Ice Age world held them in a rare moment of balance. Fire burned softly, voices faded, sleep came easily, and the stars watched from above, ancient and unchanging, over a small band of determined humans who carried their fragile light into the deep winter night.
The next morning rose quietly, with the same pale sunlight filtering through the shelter walls. But something felt different, not urgent, not dangerous, but
but full of a gentle sense of completion. The group stirred slowly, warmed by the comfort of another night with food, security, and one another. The elder man was already awake, sitting near the fire and sharpening the same stone blade he had used for years. His movements were steady, unhurried, shaped by a lifetime of repetition and refinement. As the young hunter rose and joined him, the elder smiled faintly. "You are learning," he said simply. The young hunter nodded, settling beside him. There was no need for grand speeches. In their world, progress and pride lived in action, not in words. He watched the blade catch light as it turned in the elder's hands, and he felt a quiet certainty that he too would one day sit like this, passing knowledge to someone new. Across the shelter, the young woman began her morning tasks. She lifted the drying bison hide and ran her fingers across it. Soft, pliable, strong. She imagined the finished coat it would become. Perhaps it would be for the young hunter, perhaps for one of the children. It did not matter. The work itself was the gift. The older woman approached her with a small nod. "You've done well," she murmured. "Tomorrow we begin shaping the garment." The young woman smiled, feeling the warmth of praise that went beyond simple acknowledgement. In their world, mastery was earned step by step, day by day. Outside, the snow gleamed under the rising sun. Tracks from the previous day had nearly vanished, covered by a light drift. The world was clean again, erased and rewritten, as it always was in winter. The day passed with peaceful purpose. The hunters repaired worn tools. The women and older hunters smoked the last of the meat. The children played near the shelter, practicing spear throws with small sticks, pretending to be part of yesterday's hunt. The elder reviewed the tools one by one, making sure nothing was left dull or neglected. As the sun dipped low, turning the sky gold and lavender, the group gathered around the fire for the evening meal. Steam rose from cooked bison meat and root broth, filling the air with a comforting aroma. Everyone ate slowly, letting the warmth chase away the chill creeping in from outside. Afterwards, voices rose in soft conversation, the kind best spoken by firelight. The bowman told a quiet story, not of victory, but of patience, about a hunt from his youth when he waited 3 days for the right moment. The older woman shared a memory of a winter even harsher than this one, when the group survived by ingenuity and stubbornness alone. The children listened eye-wide, absorbing stories that would someday become their lessons, their history, their guidance. The young hunter looked into the flames and realized something important. Survival was not only about food and shelter. It was about stories, knowledge, the passing of wisdom from one generation to the next. These stories kept them alive as surely as meat and firewood did. Later, once the talking faded, a soft quiet settled over the shelter again. The elder stood slowly, leaning on his spear like an old friend. He spoke to the group in the hush of the fire's glow. "We live because we learn. We learn because we live together." It was the closest thing to a blessing their camp had. The young woman looked around the shelter, at tired but content faces, at the warm fire, at the racks of preserved food drying in the smoke, at the safe space carved out of a brutal world. She felt a deep, grounding truth, a feeling older than language. They were not merely surviving, they were living. As night deepened, they lay down beneath layered hides and furs. The fire softened to slow glowing embers. One by one the sounds of breathing filled the shelter, steady and peaceful. Outside, the ice age continued, vast, cold, indifferent. But nestled in their circle of firelight, the group existed as a small but powerful defiance against the wild. Hands making tools, minds learning patterns, hearts caring for one another. They did not conquer the land, they understood it. They did not fight the season, they worked with it. They survived because they adapted, helped one another, and carried the fire forward, generation by generation. As sleep finally settled over them, the sky above stretched wide and eternal. Stars glittered across the heavens, silent witnesses to the ancient, ongoing story of human perseverance. And in that small shelter of fur and smoke and dreams, a world-ending winter felt just a little less cold.